Our next speaker is Sam Sorensen. He is a graduate student studying game design at NYU's Game Center, and his talk is called Multiple Role-Playing Groups in a Shared Campaign World. And I will now turn it over to you. Sam, take it away.
Hello, as mentioned, I am Sam Sorensen, and this is Multiple Role-Playing Groups in a Shared Campaign World. So this is a talk about RPGs, about world design and narrative design. It's about lots of groups in one world together, playing together as one cohesive game. It's some explanation as to how you do this, drawing from my own experience across several different campaigns, 3 long ones and a handful of short ones, plus some research done in there, some of which will see the light of day eventually and some of it won't. It's talking about why you want to do this and what interesting things happen as a result. It's how these principles might be able to apply elsewhere in other fields of game design other than tabletop RPGs, and it's a mix of theory, anecdotes, and my own analysis. So I am Sam Sorensen. I am a game designer focusing on RPGs, narrative, and systems. I just graduated from RIT from their game design program, and now I'm headed to NYU to the Game Center to get an MFA in the fall. I've been playing, running, and designing RPGs for years, along with other kinds of games. I am, of course, the person delivering this talk to you right now. I'm a very fast talker, especially when I'm nervous, like I am right now. So if I'm going too fast, please tell me to slow down. And you can find me on Twitter at Head of the Goat if you have any questions or other things after this talk is over. So just some initial definitions of terms. An RPG is a role-playing game, specifically a tabletop one in my case, like D&D or a bunch of other ones. A role-playing group is the people that you play with, usually in fiction as some kind of party or team. The people who come over to your house and sit around your dining room table and, eat snacks and roll dice and yell at you. The game master or GM is the person who runs the game. They play the NPCs, the enemies, the world as a whole. And then a session is a single session of play where you sit around a table, as I mentioned, with your friends for a few hours. A campaign is a series of linked play sessions, usually following a single storyline, like defeat the evil necromancer or save the lost princess or whatever. The campaign world is the settings, location, and kind of general place that your campaign takes place in. The players are the people at the table, and the characters are the people in the world. The distinction between those two matters because they're not the same, though they are strongly linked. Sometimes players will make decisions, sometimes characters will make decisions, and those two are not always the same thing. So a shared campaign world, what is that? Typically, each role-playing group and each GM has their own world that they play in. They're the sole players there. All the world influence comes from either them in their decisions and actions or from the GM. It's very much in the same vein as like a single-player digital role-playing game. In a shared campaign world, however, multiple groups play in the same fictional space together. Narrative influence emerges not just from the single group of players and their single GM, but rather from all of the players collectively playing in this world together. It shifts the lens from just, sort of one singular thing to suddenly being much wider and broader. So practically what this looks like, in my experience, is that the GM, one GM, or occasionally a few GMs, will meet with each group once per week or once per time unit. If you're busy, maybe it's once per month or once every couple of months or once every other week or something. Play happens asynchronously. So it's not that you have all of your groups sitting together in one giant room together or cordoned off into separate rooms. It's that one GM will play with each group on different days of the week and then knit those narratives together and maintain continuity sort of independently. The actions of one group can, but don't necessarily have to, affect other groups. So if one group does something, it will have ripple effects on others. And usually the GM or GMs are the only ones who know all of the pieces. Players see what they see in character, but the GM sees everything. So there are kind of 2 basic modes for these kinds of shared worlds and the campaigns that happen in them. There are cooperative ones where the groups work towards shared goals. They coordinate informations and plans and resources and objectives. There are like persistent world challenges, sort of in the same vein as like an MMO almost, that can be defeated or overcome as time goes on. And in this case, groups can easily be kind of amorphous and indistinct. What ends up happening oftentimes is you get a player pool where there will be like 20 players, and each week groups will kind of form from those 20 of, oh, this week we need these 3 and this week we need these 2 because one of them has magic or something. And so you form groups on the fly from a broader cohesive player pool. In competitive style, which is not necessarily distinct style, and these are quite fuzzy. There's a lot of overlap between these 2 groups if there needs to be, or these 2 styles. But in competitive play, usually groups work against each other. So they might be different factions, they might be opposing forces, they might be, raw competitors from anything from a war to a sports tournament. In this case, though, information, objectives, activities are usually kept secret. If you're playing the Rebel Alliance striking against the evil Empire, then your secret plan to, take out their listening post needs to be kept secret, both from the players and the characters. This leans towards highly factional play of groups tend to quickly stratify and stick to their own and play against each other. And there's lots of politicking and scheming and playing against each other, which is really fun, as I'll get to later, but is definitely something to be working with. And as this happens, I have found that group identities become increasingly strong in competitive play. In cooperative, they tend to be sort of like one unified group, but in competitive, they tend to be like, this is our team, this is our squad, and we're working on our own. So initially, when players start out as they're getting their footing, they tend to only affect each other a little bit, sort of incidentally here and there. But as time goes on, their influence as players tend to grow, usually within the power curve of an RPG system, but also more broadly, they tend to just affect each other more as they know what to look for. In competitive play, the focus of what players do almost always shifts towards each other. So rather than focus on some GM specific focus, it almost always moves to like, let's go harass that other team, let's go attack that other team, let's play against them, let's focus less on the kind of like imposed game GM challenges and more on each other directly. In cooperative play, the arc tends to be somewhat similar in that while the group does get more coordinated over time, the big juicy drama that comes out over the course of play is inside the group. So they'll be disagreeing on what the best decision is, how best to move forward, all that kind of thing comes out as well. So now I'm going to talk broadly about how to run multiple groups, again, based on my own experience running lots of these over the past several years, and sort of tips and tools if you want to try to do this yourself. So just from a logistical standpoint, and this kind of sounds obvious, but coordination and communication are key. You have to be talking to each other a lot, specifically GM to players, but even player to player matters a lot as well. And if you have multiple GMs, that is an absolute necessity. I recommend that you set up a shared digital space, like a Discord server, a Facebook group, some kind of means to communicate with each other outside of in person or via email list or something. The GM or GMs should provide their schedule as soon as possible each week so that players can start scheduling sessions and that the GMs can be clear on when they can and can't do. Sessions should be scheduled publicly, especially in cooperative games. Obviously, in competitive games, there can be a little bit of subterfuge here, but it's important that you separate the out-of-game competition with the in-game competition. Of out-of-game, you don't want to be picking fights because you're scheduling sessions with the GM at one time or another. Like, just make that clear. And if you're recruiting players, especially early on, you should strive to recruit active, engaged players, people who are willing to invest and really sink their teeth into the game to not just be passive audience members here to be taken along for a roller coaster, but to actually decide their own fates and push forward and engage in the mechanics and story of the game. For the overarching narrative of your game world and kind of your campaign as a whole, a single big narrative is highly important, meaning that while there can and should be details, having some kind of large conflict that sets up your story as a whole, like it's a war, or there's a scandal happening, or you are political players, or something that helps provide definition to the whole campaign is very important. It helps to define who the player characters are. And you should do as much of this beforehand as you can. Tell your players who they're going to be playing, define their role. Say you're playing a special strike team, saying you're going to play the football team at this one high school, say you're going to play the crew of this one specific spaceship, and then have them craft characters specifically fitted for this campaign and that role. Having group identities is key. The more you can get them to invest in the world and each other, the better the game will be. You should plan as GM the big conflicts and specific events, but you don't want to devise a story or plot ahead of time. So, say you're doing a game where the players are defending against an incoming invasion. So, say, okay, well, the invaders are coming from the north, and these are the 3 cities they're going to take first. But you don't need to be planning like specific narrative beats to hit. Just plan what the world would do and go from there. And of course, you should be leaving lots of space for development and new events, both in your world and your overarching narrative and what your NPCs will be doing. Once you have the overarching world established, you should zero in on one specific area or possibly successive areas, depending on how your campaign functions, like a city or a country or a region or something. And you can then develop this region in more detail, add in key NPCs, add important locations, possible opportunities. You should establish the player character's base of operations. It doesn't need to be a literal base of operations, but some kind of home turf they can call their own. It could be a spaceship they're traveling on. It could be their own fortress. It could be their locker room. It could be all manner of locations, but some place that they can go and come back from. Once that setup is done, you should give the players a few hooks, a few kind of like inklings of what's out in the world, but then just turn them loose. let them go and decide their own fates. As you're doing all of this, it really helps if you build in potential energy. Set up powder kegs, right? Build in tension. I'll cover this more in a bit, but you should be building things that the players can interact with and instantly go off. Let them be the fuse to the powder keg of your world. So, information. Players learn things during sessions, right? Players of any game learn things during play. That sounds kind of obvious, but once they're out of a session, players can choose to share that info with other players, but they aren't required to. So if they go and they delve into some ancient ruins and they discover a curse that will afflict anybody who wields the sacred sword of doom, they could share that with their friend who wields the sacred sword of doom, or they could not. There's suddenly becomes kind of a marketplace of information, which I'll cover more in a bit, but information and data and knowledge becomes very important. Inevitably, some of it will fall through the cracks of, two of your players who are in different groups will be going out and getting coffee together because they're friends, and one of them will mention offhandedly something that happened in the session, and one of them will realize that they shouldn't know that in character, and that's fine, frankly. Just tell your players that it will happen and acknowledge it and move on. As I mentioned, sometimes players are put in situations is helpful. They need passwords, there's dangers and stuff. And having knowledge that they don't have but their friends might suddenly becomes very valuable. But as part of this kind of game, players are not allowed, or really should be strongly discouraged from contacting groups outside of their own while in a session. So if we're in a session, I can't text my friend who's not in this session, who's in a different group, and ask them for information. If you think about this in fiction, if your strike team leaves the mothership spaceship to go down to planetfall, and then they're down there for 2 weeks and their communications get jammed, they won't have means to talk to their home base. They don't have means of in fiction learning the knowledge that they need. So as players go around and do whatever it is they're doing, the GM should be taking notes on that, and the players will be making changes, either small ones like footprints or bullet holes, or big ones like setting fire to a building or assassinating a key NPC or something like that. Whatever these changes are, they're referred to as player indices. This comes from Clara Fernandez Vara's DIGRA talk from like 5 or 10 years ago about player indices. But the indices is anything that players leave behind, anything that is an index that they were there, specifically one that was left behind by mechanical interaction. And then returning players can find these indices, like bullet holes, like a burned forest, like scratch marks or bloodstains, or these are all very violent ones, but notes left behind or whatever it is. Players leave chalk marks on the wall for each other. And they can find those and then start to piece together whatever happened last time. Obviously, as GM, you can and should be setting these indices yourself, but when players start leaving them, there starts to be a chain of internal world coherency. There's sort of a raw continuity to it of if you affect the world, those effects stick around. And suddenly, there's this high level of verisimilitude that comes just from mechanical interactions, and players can start to piece together sort of an investigative kind of storytelling of what happened here before just on the mechanical after effects of play. So as you're running, and this is kind of more of a stylistic thing, less than necessarily a raw necessity of this style, but I find it works much better. But as GM, wherever possible, you should avoid making direct decisions of just saying, this is cool, so I think I'm going to do it. Instead, you should be using systems, use random tables, use other decision-making engines. And some of my experiences, what I've done is if there's some NPC that's a big bad, I'll just text one of my friends or professors who's not in the game, but is an outsider, explain the situation to them and say, what would you do if you were this NPC? You should strive to have the NPCs and factions and world react according to the player's actions. So when the players do something, do in response whatever would make sense for the NPC. Don't do what needs to like fit your prearranged plot. Just have the NPC or faction or world force, if it's a jungle fauna, just do whatever makes sense for them in fiction. As this happens, let the players see the direct mechanical and narrative results of their actions. If they assassinate the leader of the opposing political party, then there's going to be chaos and rioting, to use a somewhat relevant example. If they, decide to seize command of some force, then let there be ripple effects. Make the cause and effect loop of the game extremely clear, so players, when they make a decision, will know what that decision does. As I mentioned, don't plan a plot. Don't have some prearranged story events that need to happen. Just let the players decide their own directions and do what they're going to do. It's well known in RPG circles that in ordinary games, the GM's plans will get messed up by players. It might take one session, it might take 10, but at some point, players are going to do something that is like dramatically off the rails, and you're going to have to scrap whatever you had planned and come up with something new. In big shared games, where instead of having 6 players, you now have 20, this happens even faster, especially once they start messing with each other. Um, you should be giving players lots of opportunities to make a big impact in a world and thus each other. You should let the actions of the characters be the story rather than having some pre-planned plot they act through. Let the players be actors and directors on a stage, not readers of a script. So time. This is one of the big questions I get all the time. Timekeeping is really important, but it's really hard to do well. Generally, each week session should take place inside one same span of time, like a month or week in game, and then each out-of-game week should translate to roughly that same amount of in-game time. So this week is a month of the war campaign, and then the next week will be the next month, and so on. Sessions should be loosely confined to that span of time, and if players do some operation or some activity that would take more than that time, let it span more than one session. So over the course of your 4-hour session on Wednesday, you play through a whole month's worth of in-game time because that's what we set the spans to be. So continuity and overlap, this is another thing that gets complicated fast. Groups will overlap. It will happen. They will run into each other, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. When this happens, you should strive to maintain continuity, and you should not be afraid to step out of character to explain to your players what's happening. Say, hey, you're running into another player group and they did this, and so if you want to like blow their brains out or something, that's going to mess with the already existing continuity. So encourage players to think about the game as a whole, not just themselves, and take actions that, while they still make sense in character, will not immediately disrupt that continuity. As always, a little bit of retconning here and there is fine and sometimes good. But this is a complicated situation, and so strive to take your players into it so they know what's happening. Combined sessions. This is probably the most fun that will happen. But in rare special cases, one or more groups will get together and play a session as one very large group. So if you have 2 teams of 6, they might come together to do something. It might be a masked raid, it might be a climactic showdown, it might be a distressful team operation. Think about the Avengers teaming up with the Justice League, right? No matter what it is, there's huge narrative potential there. These, as I mentioned, are some of the most fun and dramatic sessions that ever happen. And the players, as time goes on, will want to do more and more and more of these. They love them. So, talking about world building for multiple groups and how and why you might do that. In terms of differences to ordinary world building, which it varies, there's not one hard delineation, but more of the world will be seen in more traditional narrative structure, more will be seen with multiple player groups than in a traditional narrative structure and from more angles. So think about the world less in terms of what the players just see in a line and more about what the whole world looks like. It needs to be actively involved but not overshadow them. There needs to be lots of fodder that they can interact with, stuff that players can work with, they can sink their teeth into, they can really get to grips with quickly and easily. And the world is, as sort of always, but in this case more so, it is the primary means that you interact with the players. You can't have key NPCs who show up and exposit. You need to tell stories through the world itself. You should establish a major conflict early and essentially. At every turn the players look, there should be conflict. This tension should exist on multiple levels: political, social, economic, spiritual, moral. Whatever it is, make sure that every NPC, every faction, every individual, everything the players come across, some way contributes to that tension. You need to force them into it. Lots of RPGs like to have some weird option where if you talk to every NPC in the village, then you get some magical third high road that doesn't involve pissing anyone off. Don't do that. Force your players to get involved in the conflict of the world, to take sides, to take actions. As you're building, you should focus on structures early on and not necessarily details. Focus on the elements of the world that affect everything: power structures, economic systems, social spheres, psychological constructs, key narrative conceits. You don't need to know every single minor detail. You need to know stuff that will immediately impact your players. Focus on the meaning of things rather than the lore itself. And then always don't be afraid to make big world building decisions. If you say that all magic is suddenly illegal, your 6 wizard players are suddenly going to have a really interesting, rough time. Those kinds of constraints breed creativity and drama. Make big decisions with your world and then let your players interact with them. As you're building, think in terms of the systems, not only of your game system, right? If you're using D&D in terms of strength and dexterity, or if you're playing Blades in the Dark in terms of tier and quality, but think about how your players can interact with the events of your world and how that cause and effect loop happens. Think about what each individual wants and how they might get it. Think about the scenarios of what will happen if players ally or destroy or avoid or undermine these NPCs or organizations, and use the mechanics of your game to your advantage in that context. As always, nothing is sacred. In other words, kill your darlings. If there is something, a person or a faction or a location that is just essential to your world, rewrite it. No person should be so important that if your players decide to murder them in cold, some important person who build your world, so no matter how the players go about interacting with it, something interesting will happen. There should be no like fail states on the world. I mean, obviously, push your world into the post-apocalypse. That's fun and interesting, but don't have the campaign end because players took some unexpected action. As you're building, do so continuously. As they move throughout the world, build what they need. Don't try to do everything at once from the beginning, but instead focus on, okay, if they go to this location, now they need these NPCs. If they go to this place, now they need these details. Save them until they're relevant. Don't lore dump, just exposit what they need as they need it. You should be introducing in nuance and detail, right? So if you say, okay, this is the evil empire, but now suddenly we have substructures and some, loyalists and some people who are dissenting. Build in nuance, but don't undermine the original message of the structure itself. As you go, give players what they're interested in. Don't build things that you don't need. Just see what they're focused on, see what piques their interest, and then give them more of that. That makes for good play. So, why run multiple groups? Why do this? Why not just run a regular campaign? So the first and kind of most obvious one is lots of players. Of practically lets you play with way more than the standard kind of 4 to 6 players. If you're like me and you play RPGs with lots of people and suddenly find yourself with 12 friends and you can't fit them all in one session because your table's not big enough, run multiple groups. This is a fun and engaging style of play that will engage lots more players. It's especially good if you have uncertain or varying schedules, since sessions, especially in cooperative play, can be scheduled kind of more on the fly. And it means that like if one person has to drop out for a week or we have somebody who wants to drop in later, months later, you can do that. It's much more flexible, it's much more open, and much more manageable for people with busy lives. With the sandbox style of play comes a player-centric focus of players are at the foreground. Because players are so unpredictable, you can't really have key NPCs or plot elements, and so it means that the onus of storytelling is now on the players. In competitive games, this means that both the heroes and the villains of the story are players. There's drama on both sides. Both teams see themselves as heroes, or all 6 teams do, depending. Having a large body of players means that engagement will rise. If one group comes back and says like, hey, we just killed that dragon that's been harassing us for months, now other groups are like, oh man, I want to do that too. You get these moments where it starts to feed in on itself as players get more and more engaged with the actions of themselves and others. And of course, as they see the widespread impact of this, they become intoxicated by it. So it's like, man, we can do anything and it means something because it's such a sandbox style of play. So something happens that I've noticed that I call the anti-Chekhov's gun, which is that events will be happening basically all the time. And while the focus is on players, there's no group that's ever in the spotlight. And so groups will like hear about events of, oh, there were some explosions in District 2, or, oh man, did you hear about that scandal where, a teacher was caught stealing from the school or something? And those won't be immediately relevant to them. That will just be happening. And the ripple effect means they'll hear about them. While in regular RPG, there's a sense that like everything that comes up should be relevant later, like in traditional fictional storytelling. Here, stuff just happens. And the explanation for it won't be obvious. Players might investigate and they'll find, sort of weird rabbit holes of what other players did. And while that sounds kind of backwards to storytelling, it's good world building because that's how real life functions. So sometimes things just happen for reasons that are explainable, but they're distant. And when players do go investigating, you have a rabbit hole for them to go down, and that helps flesh out the world further in causality. As I mentioned earlier, information becomes a currency. In a regular campaign, players have information or they don't. It becomes very binary and very GM-centric. But with multiple groups, information suddenly becomes a valuable resource, something that is true in both cooperative and competitive. Politics and intrigue and secret broking all become very valuable and rewarding and entertaining ways to play. It moves the game away from strictly mechanical areas of play, like fighting and combat, or leveling up your character, to suddenly a much more roleplay focused area where what matters are character details and narrative history and the secrets that you and your characters know. And that I think is much more interesting and engaging oftentimes because it means that you're putting the characters and their own narrative beats forward rather than just the mechanics of play. It will inevitably happen that you'll get complicated, messy relationships. When you start putting NPCs and factions in between competing groups, it forces complicated relationships, triangles, or quadrangles, or pentangles, or hextangles, or whatever. I've seen this where, one NPC will be lovers to 2 different player characters whose family members side with this NPC, but then their squads don't, and you end up with like a 6-way standoff with 12 players involved, which is fantastic drama. It's so juicy. It's so good. As you put these nuanced decisions, the moral, the tactical, the familial, all kinds of decisions in front of groups, there become these tense interpersonal narratives where, because suddenly they don't have to stay with their group, they could defect and join another one. There's all kinds of new narrative that opens up that wouldn't be possible in a regular RPG, because there's multiple groups, because they connect, because they get more complicated. Their relationships grow in complexity and nuance, and drama starts to emerge. It's messy and it gets complicated so fast, but it's awesome. And finally, as you might be knowing, or maybe not quite finally, but close to the end, emergent narrative happens, obviously. As groups take actions, the landscape of their campaign will change and the groups will have to adapt. Drama is driven by the players and by systems, not by some preconceived plot. Players will react to each other dynamically. As one group does something, another one will respond, and they do this on the fly, and they do this themselves, and so it creates a level of verisimilitude there where players react in the same way characters would. They can't guess what's going to happen because nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody's decided it because it's all players and dice. And that means that the tension is real of players can and will fail. They'll get crushed. They'll get stomped on by other groups. But that's good, interesting drama because now the winners are on top and the losers are now hunting for vengeance. Everything that happens drives the story forward because it's just players reacting to the system of your game in a huge context. So in conclusion, multiple groups allow for lots of players in one united campaign. They encourage proactive, engaged players. They're difficult and demanding, but they're hugely rewarding. They allow for intense, dramatic, emergent narratives, more so than you get in a regular game. They center the players in the world rather than a predestined plot, and they're super cool and they're rad and not popular enough. You should do one. Now I'll take questions. As mentioned, I'm Sam Sorensen. You can find me on Twitter if you have questions after this. I have 3 minutes left, so I have 3 minutes for questions, which I'm told will be read aloud to me, so I'm going to sit here quietly until that happens. Thank you. Hello.
Yeah, we've got a couple minutes for live questions in the questions and answer to channel, and if none, but I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Reminds me of my favorite, I guess, classic story of multi-party, multi-person campaign, competitive campaigns, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with, just the Head of Vecna campaign story.
Yes.
Which was sort of my introduction to the idea that, like, oh, right, you totally could run multiple parties at the same time. I mean, it would be a tremendous amount of work, but it's possible. And the story that you're going to have fall out of that, I guess, the emergent narrative is going to be far more interesting and also probably, like, much funnier than anything that you would get just playing through the, a pre-made campaign
absolutely.
or whatever. And like lends itself to being retold to people who weren't part of it in a way that I find sometimes telling people what happened in your D&D campaign is like describing what happened in your dream.
Yeah.
Like it was really interesting if you were there.
Yeah. The most fun thing that happens is you get one player who start telling a story, and then another one will walk into the room and be like, no, that's not what happened. They'll tell a different version of the story. And then suddenly you have competing narratives that are yelling over each other, trying to explain to some poor third party who just wanted to hear about your D&D game.
Right. Yeah. I have never had the pleasure of playing in one of those, but I think, someday that would be.
Yeah.
But I think that it's mostly like because of the like actual just labor involved in doing that. It almost feels like it's, I guess, as somebody who is currently DMing for one party right now, like it does sort of become another job. And I'm thinking about like the multiplicative force.
The thing about it that I found is that the returns tend to be higher. Of if you build, a city street, you can use that city street for 10 sessions because players are going to be coming back there. Mm-hmm. So, the focus is less on like building a new dungeon each session for each group and more like saying, here's the shared space we play in, and you can use that over and over again. And then as a player blow up a building, now you have a blow up building there instead. Right.
Have you tried this sort of these things that you're talking about across multiple settings? And then we do have to move to Discord because it's time. But
yeah, absolutely. Primarily, the three I've run, the big long ones I ran were one of them was a D&D game, one of them was Blades in the Dark, set in Duskfall, and then one of them was a hacked version of Scum and Villainy, a Blades hack set in Star Wars using a bunch of transmedia elements.
Okay.
Plus a bunch of small ones. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll move you to Discord.
Great.
And I will be back with our next talk imminently.